Hi, I'm Woody Farah, and I want to welcome you to a introduction to the life of Christ. This is a recording that I'm doing from home today. Hopefully, this will work so that if you miss or can't attend the live teaching, this recording will suffice. So let me get started here by sharing my screen, and I want to make sure I get this going. Right. So hopefully, I'm really hoping this works. I'm going to share the slideshow. Okay. I think this is working. Let me come back up here. So this is the introduction, Life of Christ. All right. In this study, I've used quite a few resources, and these are the main ones that I have listed here for you. Let me see if I can kind of get this up here. The first one I use is called The Life and the Times of Jesus the Messiah. This is a picture of the book off of Amazon. It's a really large book. Alfred Edersheim was a Jew in Germany, became a believer in Christ, and he wrote this giant, massive book in 1883, revised again in 1886. He was very familiar with Judaism and the writings of Jewish rabbis and historical information from them. It's a remarkable book. It's a lot of writing. It's a lot of small print, and it's also written in the style of 1886. So it's not a simple read. It's not an easy read. You have to kind of pay attention to it, but I'll guarantee you it's worth reading. And that one gives you a lot of background. Another one that I found fascinating is this one here. It's called The Greatest Story. And it's a unique blending of the four Gospels, as you see by the title. It was originally written by this guy, Johnston M. Cheney. He began it in the 1960s. I think he passed away in like 1967, before the book was actually finished and published. And then this guy, Stanley Ellison, came along and finished it for him and published it with the help of his family and other people. Cheney did something really interesting. He wanted to take the Gospels, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and blend them into a single narrative. So like you could pick it up and read it like a single story. He was fascinated with what is called a harmony of the Gospels, and he wanted to go beyond that. Instead of just putting passages of scripture side by side, he wanted to blend them together. But what he did was really unique. He went directly to the Greek New Testament and translated directly from the Greek New Testament all of the Gospels and put them together into a single story. And it was originally called The Life of Christ in Stereo. He chose the word stereo because of the Greek meaning of the word stereo. It means the life of Christ from various viewpoints. So that's a pretty interesting one right there. This is a cool story. I really enjoyed that. Now, I also found this one here, the NIV Harmony of the Gospels, Robert Thomas and Stanley and Gundry. This is a updated version of the original Harmony of the Gospels, which was done with the old King James Version, and it was by Dr. A.T. Robertson. Dr. Robertson did that originally in something like, if I remember correctly, 1898, something like that. It was revised again in like 1903 and again in 1922. And then this is a brand new copy. In fact, this one here was done, I think, in the late 60s or the early 70s. This is the copy of the one that I have at my home. The thing about a harmony of the Gospels is that it takes Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John and lays them out in parallel, and takes all the common events. It tries to put it in chronological order. It attempts to do that. Sometimes you can't do that. But it's very fascinating the way it's done. And it's all of the Gospels laid out side by side. It doesn't make any attempt to blend them into a single story. So in other words, you can read, if something is recorded in both Matthew and Mark, you can see them in parallel and you know what they look like. So that's kind of the way that works. The NIV Harmony of the Gospels did. Now, in just about every major Bible that you have, regardless of the version, King James, New King James, New American Standard, NIV, New Living Bible, Christian Standard Bible, any number of these Bibles, almost every single one of them will have the Harmony of the Gospels by Dr. A.T. Robertson. And it'll either be placed between the Old and New Testament, or be placed at the very end of your Bible after the book of Revelation, somewhere around the concordance. So that's a pretty neat thing. I came across this fascinating textbook. Mark Strauss wrote this. It's called Four Portraits, One Jesus. This is the second edition. It's a large, it's an academic book. It would be the book you would study if you went to Bible college or seminary. And it's just Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But it also gives you a lot of cultural stuff, a lot of history, a lot of background, a lot of external listings too of non-biblical sources that also mention Jesus. It's an outstanding textbook. I highly recommend it if you would like some scholarly material, and you'll gain a lot of great stuff on that. In addition to that, this book here called A Survey of the New Testament is by Robert H. Gundry. This was one of my old seminary textbooks. Dr. Gundry wrote this. Now, this, of course, isn't just the gospel. This is the entire New Testament, but it gives you cultural information, archaeological information as well, and as well as good solid information on every single book. It's an excellent work, and I want to encourage you to find that too. You can probably pick these up at even at a used bookstore, but you can order them also off the usual locations. All right, now here's the next one I want to show you. You probably never heard of this. It's called Rediscovering Jesus. It's got three authors, David Capes, Rodney Reeves, and Randolph Richards. I know David Capes. He happened to be one of the professors at my seminary that I went to get my master's degree in counseling, Houston Graduate School of Theology. David Capes signed my copy, not like that. He was also one of the translators in a Bible version called The Voice. So there's a Bible translation called The Voice, and pretty good translation. I've got that one too. What I like about this particular book, it has two parts. It talks about discovering Jesus from Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but also the way Paul saw Jesus, the way maybe the priest of Israel would have seen Jesus, and so forth. Then there's a second part, which is more of a modern way of looking at Jesus, what the Muslims think of Jesus. That's one of them, what different groups. It's a fascinating book. I want to encourage you to get that if you can. So those are just some of the textbooks. I use some other ones, but these are the main ones that I use to go for. Now, I love different Bibles and different study Bibles. So here's one of them that I have here. Haley's Study Bible. I use this one a lot. I think it's probably one of my favorite study Bibles of all, the ones that I have. Dr. Haley was a believer in Christ. He was a pastor. He was also a lecturer. He memorized just about every book in the Bible, literally memorized it. He would stand and speak in public, and he would, as he would lecture on a book, he would first quote the book and then go back and make notes on it. He first began to write a little tiny paper pamphlet called Haley's Handbook for the Bible. And it was small enough you could fold it up and put it in your pocket. Eventually, as the decades went by, it just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. He passed away, I think, somewhere in the, I forget when he passed away, maybe the 1960s or something like that. His handbook remained very, very popular for so long. Now, his family has produced what is called a Haley Study Bible. And this particular one that I have is the New International Version. And it is just outstanding. I so thoroughly enjoy it. I would encourage you to get a hold of that one too. The next one that I enjoy studying is this one here called the NIV Study Bible. You can find it in various sizes. I happen to have one that's called the personal size. And it has a lot of archaeological stuff. It has a lot of the notes and so forth inside of it as well. Outstanding. This is the Holman Bible Publishers Christian Standard Bible. This one's pretty good as well. It has also the references as well, and archaeological references and cultural references and so forth. This is the English Standard Version. This is the ESV Study Bible. Like all study Bibles, has notes, archaeological references, historical references, cultural references. Now, this is the Scofield. I couldn't find the picture of the one I actually have. It's called the Scofield Study System. This is called the Scofield Study Bible 3. I think it's the same one. I don't remember, but I have it in the New King James Version as well. I got to tell you, Scofield came out back around the turn of the century. His Bible got popular because of the old Scopes monkey trial in the 1920s that took place in Tennessee, where there was a law against teaching evolution, and a school teacher named Scope taught some of Darwin, and it went to court. He lost, and But in the process, the attorneys referenced the Scofield Reference Bible, which was kind of new in its day because it had some notes and so forth about Genesis chapter 1. It was referred to in the law. That's kind of made Scofield's Bible famous. It's gone through a lot of iterations. It's a very conservative type of a Bible. It comes from that kind of a background. So if you're looking for that, that's a good one. The exact opposite of the conservatives of these guys here, the New Oxford Annotated Bible. This is a New Revised Standard Version. It also contains the Apocrypha, which I'll talk about some other time. This is an excellent reference work. It comes from a non-conservative viewpoint. So if you're looking for alternative viewpoints or you wanted just some sort of a challenge to all these things, this is a good one for that. I recommend it to you. I found it to be very interesting in all the things that I read. Then there is this one here, the Chronological Study Bible. Man, I got to tell you, this is my favorite. It arranges the Bible in chronological order. One of the things I didn't understand when I first became a Christian was that the Bible is not arranged in chronological order. I just sort of assumed it was. Most of us do. But the Bible is not. So one of the things that this study Bible does is not only arranges all of the scriptures in a chronological order so that you can read them as if you were reading them in order, but it also contains a lot of archaeology, a lot of cultural notes, a lot of theological notes and charts and diagrams and wonderful material to really make this a worthwhile study Bible. In fact, as we go through the life of Christ, I'm going to use this one here, the Chronological Study Bible, for everything we're going to do. All right. Now, when you approach the life of Christ, you really want to go through and ask yourself a simple question. How do we study the life of Jesus? There's four basic ways of approaching Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. One is what is called vertically. Vertically means I read each of the Gospels individually and separately. Like I read Matthew, I'll let Matthew tell me about Jesus from Matthew's point of view. I read Mark, and I'll let Mark tell me about Jesus from Mark's point of view. I read Luke, and I read John, each one separately. Horizontally means I read them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but I compare them with each other. In other words, I want to see how different is Matthew from Mark? How similar are they? How about Matthew and Luke? And how about Matthew, Mark, and Luke? And how about all of them compared with John? So it's an interesting way of reading, and it's a real common way of reading. So that's a valuable tool. There's also what's called the harmony, which you blend the Gospels into either a harmonized form where you lay them side by side, make no real attempt to blend them totally, unless you do something like what Cheney did with his book. In that case, you sort of create a single narrative. But that's an advantage. This way you get to see, instead of reading an entire gospel and then comparing it to another gospel, you're reading the gospel in its bits and its pieces as it goes along. Chronologically is how we're going to do it. You may never have done it this way before, so this would be a challenge for you. Basically, you arrange the content of the four Gospels in their chronological time. It's important to remember that when the Gospels were written, they weren't written in a chronological order. They weren't written to be a biography either. The Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote with the purpose of having or presenting the life of Christ according to various themes. They had a very specific focus for the way they presented Jesus. Now, the main sources that tell us who Jesus is are biblical, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I'm going to say more about each of them as we go along. But outside of the Bible, extra biblical sources exist. And this is a listing of the most well-known and the ones that contain the most. Josephus Flavius was a Jew who lived during the time of Christ in the first century. And is interesting because he wrote multiple stories and histories and so forth about the Jews and the Jewish nation and the Jewish wars and so forth. There's a particular passage that is in his writings where he specifically talks about Jesus coming on the scene. And the way he talks about Jesus is very, very favorable, because some scholars even wonder if it was really his writings that did that. But there's debate about that, and I'm not a scholar in that area. You can go to josephus.org to learn more about that. You can also go to Jewish Virtual Library and read more about Josephus Flavius. You can read all of his works for free online, or you can buy them. Babylonian Talmud. You may never have heard of this, but in Judaism, there is a whole collection, a whole body of writings that are called the Talmud. And there is what is called the Mishnah, and there is the Talmud. And the Talmud is basically interpretations or quotes or teachings that go along side by side with the Torah, which is Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. And what the Talmud does is basically help someone understand the scriptures that they're reading. There's two primary ones, one called the Babylonian Talmud and the other one called the Jerusalem Talmud. The Babylonian Talmud is Jewish virtual library. You can also go to the New World Encyclopedia and find out more about that. You can just look it up online. It's all right there. And you can read it full line. But there is talks in here also about Jesus and about Christians. So it's interesting that it mentions it. It's not like it's a favorable mention, because these are Jews and they're not too happy about this. But the fact that they mention it tells you that this person, Jesus, existed. Pliny the Younger, this is a Roman source. Pliny the Younger was the son of Pliny the Elder. Pliny the Elder was killed when Mount Vesuvius erupted, and he went to try to rescue some people from Pompeii, and he was killed in the eruption of Vesuvius at Pompeii. His son, Pliny the Younger, attempted to get there and to save his father, but wasn't able to do so. So Pliny the Younger, though, mentions how among the Jews there was a stirring up and a problem among the sect of the Jews that followed a man called Christus. Christus actually is the name. Christus would be a Roman corruption of the Greek word Christos, which is the title Christ. And so Christos would be just his way of thinking about it. He, not being a Jew and not being too well acquainted with Jews, he would, all he knew that they were arguing over someone named Christos. So that's interesting because that tells you again that this person existed. Tacitus, also Roman, wrote, and you can see in this reference here, the book Annals, around AD 110. So this is getting into the beginning, early days of the 2nd century. You can go to worldhistory.org and read about him. He also wrote about how there were persecutions against this sect that were called Christians, and that they had all rallied around this man whom they believed had rose from the dead. And this is the way he refers to them. Suetonius, also a Roman, lived during the time of 69 to 122. So this is getting into the 2nd century as well. You can go to the website, worldhistory.org, and read more about him as well. Suetonius also mentions that the sect of the Jews that was called the Christians also had these problems as well. So that's another thing. There's a Greek fellow by the name of Lucian of the island of Samosata, which is an island off of Greece. This is getting into the 2nd century. He also mentions about the existence of Jesus as well. So these are non-Christian sources, non-Jewish sources, and they're, because of the rise of Christianity, they're hearing about this man named Jesus, and so they're also talking about him as well. Now, there's a collections of sayings of Jesus that have not been included in the New Testament in their entirety, but they are referenced. They are quoted from. They're referred to as the Agrapha, A-G-R-A-P-H-A. Grapha means writing. Is the negative particle, so it means not written down. Is what this Agrapha means. And one of the examples of that is where the Apostle Paul quotes Jesus. And he says, where Jesus said it's more blessed to give than to receive. Well, that's not located anywhere in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So when Jesus quotes that, or when Paul quotes that, he said, Jesus said this. Well, so that comes from a collection of sayings of Jesus that people knew about, but they weren't preserved and intact. And it wasn't kept, so there's no real record of it other than the particular quotes that other people gave, like the Apostle Paul did. Now, in 1945 and in 1948, again, there were several of these documents that were found at a place in Egypt called Nag Hammadi. And in Nag Hammadi, these writings are referred to as also a collection of sayings of Jesus. They're range in time from 3 BC all the way up to 7 AD, and even more than that, but all the way from 50 to 140 AD. There's a group of papyri that are called Oxyrhynchus, and there's also what's called the Coptic Gospel of Thomas. These are the two most well known. They supposedly claim to have a lot of sayings of Jesus recorded. They're not really anything that would be true. In fact, all of the early Christians recognized them as false, as heresy, as forgeries, and many of the statements attributed to Jesus are outright heretic. So yeah, we're not gonna buy into that. But they're there, and I think it's interesting because the fact that they exist tells you that people felt that this was a significant enough person, Jesus, that they could write things claiming to be his, and it would get people's attention. There have always been people who write forgeries. That's nothing new. There's a collection of gospels that are referred to as the apocryphal gospels. You can find them in the link that I've given you here. Any of these are available free online. You can read them out. You can find them in a published book. There's a book that was called the Lost Books of the Bible and the Forgotten Books of Eden. You can find that easily just about anywhere. I came across mine, I think, at the old Bible bookstore. Later, Bible bookstore became known as Lifeway. Lifeway.com is all they are now. But you can purchase that somewhere. And it's a collection of all kinds of books that were also considered. Some of them were considered for inclusion in the New Testament, but ultimately were rejected. But the majority of them were quite well known to be forgeries and were regarded as quite untrustworthy. And so they weren't included either. But it's interesting because what all of these sources tell us is that this person, Jesus, existed. And if he didn't exist, there'd be no need to write about him. Now, when it comes down to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, it's good to ask the questions of who wrote what and when. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are often referred to as the synoptic gospels. Synoptic comes from two Greek words meaning the seeing together. Syn, S-Y-N, and optic, those two words, the bringing together and looking at things from one point of view. They're called that because they're very similar in their content. They're arranged mostly chronologically and thematically. They use what are called pericopes, which is little vignettes of the life of Christ that are just sort of strung together to form a story. Most of them are all strung together to form a collection of a particular theme, like a collection of parables that Jesus is telling, or a collection of teachings or sermons, maybe a collection of healings, or a collection of where he's casting out demons. So it might be arranged by that. So when you read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you realize they really do look very similar. They're written in the same style. And this is why they're called the Synoptic Gospels. Now, among scholars, there's been a lot of debate as about which one wrote first, Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Most conservative scholars, and even quite a few liberal scholars, feel that Mark was the first one to write his gospel, and that he used for his material a source of material that is referred to as Q. It's German for a word that is pronounced Quelle, and it's Quelle, and it's the German word for source. Now, there's actually no tangible evidence for this Q, but in the Gospel of Luke in chapter 1, Luke mentions that a lot of other people have been writing about Jesus, and he read them and he used those when he compiled his gospel. So Luke mentions that he used other sources, so it's reasonable to assume Mark did. But it's also interesting that Mark was known to be a very close disciple of Peter. And after Peter was crucified in the early 60s, the Christians in Rome asked Mark if he would write down the recollections of Peter. And that became the Gospel of Mark. So yeah, that's what he did. He's more likely the first gospel to write. And many scholars, both liberal and conservative, feel that Matthew and Luke used Mark as their main source, and that they may also have used Q. We know that Luke said he used many sources because a lot of people had written about Jesus. So we know that does. Now John comes along, and John is totally different. John writes toward the very end of the first century. John doesn't bother it's really to use much of Matthew, Mark, or Luke. He's kind of unique. John rearranges the whole life of Christ around what he refers to as 7 signs of Jesus. And each of these are carefully chosen to demonstrate an aspect of the character and the personhood of Jesus. And they are designed to show us that Jesus is the Messiah and that we should be able to have faith and trust in Jesus. So Matthew, Mark, and Luke closely aligned. Their style is similar. They call it the Synoptic Gospels. John writes at the end of the century, about 30 years after each of these guys do, and he writes very differently. Now, when you look at the 4 Gospels, it's important to understand that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the traditional view, the conservative view is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are real humans, real people, and that they really lived. If you, the typical liberal and view is that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John were not historical people, didn't really live, but that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are just names given by teams of editors who collected and wrote these Gospels for various reasons. And so that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are really not real people. Their names were chosen because of their place in the gospel stories, and so to give the gospel story some validity. If you, like me, hold the traditional view, then you don't buy into this stuff. I see no reason to cast out the traditional view because there's a lot of early church fathers who knew these men and who wrote about them and who wrote about how they wrote their gospels. So I think there's enough real evidence to throw out that liberal viewpoint. So when they were written, it's a little different. Unlike most people, I feel that Mark was probably written first, written after the crucifixion of Peter. One of the early church fathers said that Mark wrote down the recollections of Peter. And so Mark's gospel really reflects the teachings of Peter and Peter's relationship to Jesus, probably written shortly after his crucifixion, maybe 66 AD at the earliest. There are some scholars that think it was written in the late 30s or the 40s. I think that's too early, but I'm not that much of a scholar, but I kind of feel like since the early church father says Peter wrote it down after after Peter was crucified, that sort of precludes the 30s and the 40s. Matthew would probably be the second one to write, either around somewhere in the late 60s, somewhere before 70 AD. Some scholars, conservative and liberal, feel that somewhere between 80 to 100 AD may also have been the time that Matthew wrote. I don't think so. I think it's more likely that he wrote before 70 AD, so somewhere in the late 60s, probably right after Mark wrote his. Luke, the Gospel of Luke, as a part of a 2-volume set, which contains the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts. And these were probably written in the early to late 60s, likely as a part of the legal process for the Apostle Paul's case before Caesar. John's Gospel, very likely written at the very end of the first century. Most church historians, most of the early church fathers recognize that John wrote his gospel somewhere toward the end of the very first century, between 90 and 100 AD, so somewhere in there. Matthew wrote mostly to Jews. His main focus was to show how Jesus is the promised Messiah, the fulfillment of all the prophecies that had been given. Mark wrote mostly to Romans, to Gentiles, and his main point was to show how Jesus was a man of action. He was a servant of God. He was a man of power. Luke wrote to a person called Most Excellent Theophilus. It's very likely Theophilus was a real person. Some scholars speculate that he may have been the Apostle Paul's lawyer and defending Paul at Caesar's court in his first imprisonment. And the reason why this would be done is because there was concern as to whether the religion had risen up from through around Jesus was a legitimate or a legal religion. The Romans literally had a list of religions that were considered legal and illegal. When they would conquer a territory, they would go in, and after conquering it, they would list out who all the deities are and how they are worshipped, and they would list out the religions, and then they would incorporate that. They would allow people to continue to worship their God. They would just add to that worship of their emperor and their own Roman deities. So that was no big deal. But Christianity didn't fit that mold. So there was some concern about, was Christianity legal? Is it illegal or is it legal? And Theophilus may have actually been Paul's lawyer getting this book to get the story of Christianity, how it arose and how it has spread so much in the Roman Empire. Now, Theophilus is also a combination of two words, theo, which is the Greek word for God, and philos is a variation of the word phileo, which means brotherly love. So Theophilus could have been just a metaphor for anyone who loves God. But the way it is written, most excellent Theophilus, tells me that it's an actual person. As to who Theophilus really was, we don't know. There's speculation. But essentially, Luke made it clear the purpose of writing his gospel was to give everyone an orderly account so that Theophilus, he says, so you could know the certainty of the things of which you've been instructed. And then lastly, we come to John. John's gospel is considered a universal gospel. He didn't write it to Jews or to Gentiles. He wrote it to everyone. And his main goal, he says, is to present Jesus as the Savior of the world that gives eternal life to all who believe in him. When you look at the life of Jesus, and you want to study the life of Christ, it's useful to look at the arrangement of Jesus's life. And generally the life of Christ is studied by breaking it up into the different years in which he went from one Passover to the next. There are basically 4 Passovers recorded in the ministry of Jesus. There's the first year, second year, the last year, and that would be the last Passover, the 4th one. So all of that is a part of that, each one. So the year of obscurity is referred to, it incorporates everything from the birth of Jesus and his childhood to his bar mitzvah in Jerusalem, and then later becoming the preacher, the rabbi, and walking out and being baptized, facing temptation, establishing himself through preaching and teaching and miracle working and casting out of demons. That's the year that he gets established and people get to know about him. The second year of his life, which is after the next Passover, you see massive multitudes following Jesus. That's where the Sermon on the Mount comes from and things like this. This is also where Jesus chooses the 12. Also, he does a lot more preaching, a lot more teaching, a lot more miracle working, a lot more exorcism. And the next Passover comes along, and that begins the last year of his life. This is where Jesus begins to predict and tell his disciples, I have to go to Jerusalem, and there I'm going to be shamefully treated. I'm going to be beaten, and I'm going to be arrested, and I'm going to be crucified, and I'm also going to rise from the dead. And the disciples do not understand that. They don't get it. This is also one of the places where Jesus asked the disciples, who do men say I am? And Peter said, well, you're the Christ, the Son of God. And this is when Jesus said, well, Peter, flesh and blood didn't reveal that to you, but my Father did. This is also where Jesus goes up on the mountain and is transfigured into his pre-incarnate glory, which is really something. The raising of Lazarus takes place, and then eventually it culminates into the Passion Week, the triumphal entry of Jesus into Jerusalem, the cleansing of the temple, the Last Supper, the crucifixion, the resurrection, and the various post-resurrection appearances where Jesus presents himself alive convincingly for 40 days. And then it ends with the ascension of Christ from the Mount of Olives back into heaven. And that's where the book of Acts picks up and starts from there. Now, our goal in this particular study is to meet Jesus. I want you to let Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John tell you about Jesus. Open your heart, open your mind to what you read. Let Jesus introduce himself to you. And then we're going to read the 4 Gospels. We're going to read them in chronological order, but we're going to read every word. We're going to read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And when we get done, and I don't know when we're going to get done, we'll take our time going through it. We will, my goal, my hope, is that you will have met Jesus in a way that you've never met him before. Let him be Jesus. Stop sharing and come back here. So I want to thank you for being a part of this particular lecture. So I'm hoping this works very well for you, and I hope you'll enjoy it. Thank you.